Picture a samurai warrior in jet black armor, katana gleaming in the sunlight, face carved from stone, ready to die for honor. It's one of the most iconic images in all of human culture. Hundreds of movies, thousands of novels, countless video games from Ghost of Tsushima to Sekiro have built entire worlds around that image. And most of us, if we're being honest, swallowed that story whole without ever questioning it. But what if I told you that most of what you think you know about samurai is actually the product of a deliberate propaganda campaign carefully engineered by the Japanese government in the 1800s? That the famous warrior code of honor, known as Bushido, didn't actually exist during the samurai's golden age? That those warriors who supposedly died before surrendering, many of them were drowning in debt, tutoring kids for pocket money, and secretly pawning the very swords they weren't supposed to live without. This is the story history was afraid to tell in full. The story of the real people behind the legend, messier, more human, and for exactly that reason, a whole lot more interesting. To understand who samurai really were, we have to go back to the beginning. Not the cinematic beginning, the actual historical one. Japan, in the 8th and 9th centuries, was a country wrestling with a very practical problem. The emperor had power on paper, but didn't have enough military muscle to defend a sprawling frontier, especially against the Emishi people pushing back from the northeast. The refined imperial court in Kyoto, buried in poetry and ceremony, had no interest in getting its hands dirty. So they did what governments throughout history have always done. When the situation gets ugly, they outsourced it. Local clans that had land manpower and weapons were granted authority by the court to protect the borders and put down rebellions. In return, they got status privileges, and most importantly, the right to carry weapons in a society where that was strictly forbidden for everyone else. These warriors gradually solidified into their own social class. And the word samurai was born derived from the old Japanese verb saburao, which simply means to serve. Let that sink in. To serve, not hero, not philosopher warrior, armed, hired help. That's the real origin of the samurai class. And from that very practical beginning over the following centuries, this class grew powerful, became the true backbone of Japanese politics. And eventually, when the regional warlords known as daimyo began tearing the country apart, samurai became the pieces on the chessboard. Then came the Sengoku period, Japan's age of warring states, which lasted from roughly the mid-1400s to the early 1600s. Think of it as roughly 150 years of near-constant civil war betrayal and shifting alliances, kind of like Game of Thrones, except everyone actually died. Samurai, in this era, were not philosophers meditating on death. They were soldiers living in mud and blood and chaos, fighting for warlords who themselves were fighting for survival. Now let's talk about Bushido, the warrior code that gets attached to samurai in virtually every conversation. Loyalty unto death, honor above life, die beautifully rather than live in shame. An entire philosophical framework for how a warrior should think, feel, and act. Sounds beautiful, right? Here's the problem. Bushido, in the form most of us understand it today, was codified remarkably late. The most famous book on Bushido, literally titled Bushido, the Soul of Japan, was written by a man named Nitobe Inazo and published in 1900. 1900. That's nearly 3 decades after the samurai class had already been officially abolished. And here's the kicker. Nitobe wrote the book in English for Western readers at a moment when Japan was aggressively trying to build its brand on the world stage. It wasn't historical documentation. It was nation branding. That's not to say samurai had no ethics or codes of conduct. They absolutely did. But those codes were fragmented, inconsistent, and evolved dramatically across different eras and different clans. A samurai in the 12th century behaved very differently from one in the 17th. A warrior under Oda Nobunaga had completely different values from one fighting in the deep south of Kyushu. There was no single unified code that everyone followed with the kind of consistency we like to imagine. In fact, even the most celebrated samurai in history routinely acted in ways that shattered the romanticized Bushido ideal. Oda Nobunaga, the man most responsible for unifying Japan, was known for being brutally, almost clinically pragmatic. He ordered massacres of entire villages, burned Buddhist temples to the ground, and used every political maneuver available to win. Nobody called him dishonorable because in actual history, victory usually matters more than the elegance of how you achieve it. But there's another truth about samurai that most people don't know, and this is where the story starts getting genuinely surprising. Samurai weren't only men. For centuries, a group of warriors has been almost deliberately erased from the history books, female samurai known as Onna Bugisha. They were trained to fight just as rigorously as men were skilled in weapons, and were expected to defend their homes and territories when the men went to war. And more than a few of them went to war themselves. Tomoe Gozen is a name even modern Japanese people recognize. In the late 12th century, during the brutal civil war between the Minamoto and Taira clans, Tomoe Gozen fought alongside her Lord Minamoto no Yoshinaka and was recorded in historical chronicles as especially beautiful, with white skin, long hair, and charming features. She was also a remarkably strong archer, and as a swordswoman, she was a warrior worth 1,000, ready to confront a demon or a god. The chronicles describe her taking enemy heads in single strokes and continuing the fight as if nothing had happened. Then there's Nakano Takeko, an Onabu geisha, who lived in the 19th century, who led an all-female combat unit at the Battle of Aizu in 1868, one of the bloodiest battles of the Meiji Restoration. She was killed charging at the front of her troops. Before she died, she asked her sister to cut off her head so the enemy couldn't claim it as a trophy, and her sister did exactly that. These women were not strange outliers. Modern archaeology has discovered that many skeletal remains on ancient Japanese battlefields long assumed to be male were actually female. A 2019 study on the 16th century battlefield of Senbon Matsubaru found that approximately 35% of warrior remains had female DNA. Nearly 1 in 3 fighters on that battlefield was a woman, and history barely mentioned it. But here's the fact that might genuinely stop you cold. In 1579, a man arrived on the shores of Japan with a Catholic missionary delegation. He was not Asian, he was not European, he came from Africa, believed to be from the region of present-day Mozambique or Ethiopia. His name was Yasuke. When Yasuke was brought before Oda Nobunaga, the warlord who controlled most of Japan, at the time, Nobunaga's first reaction was to order his attendants to scrub the man vigorously to see whether the dark color of his skin might be paint or dirt. It was not. And instead of dismissing him or treating him as a curiosity, Nobunaga was utterly fascinated. He granted Yasuke the rank of samurai, gave him weapons, and took him in as one of his most trusted personal retainers. Yasuke wasn't a symbolic gesture. He actually fought. He was present at multiple military engagements alongside Nobunaga, and when Nobunaga was assassinated in 1582, in one of the most famous betrayals in all of Japanese history, Yasuke continued fighting for Nobunaga's son before eventually being captured. What happened to him after that, nobody knows. He vanishes from the historical record, and for nearly 400 years his story was almost completely buried. Only in recent decades have historians begun to seriously excavate it. And here's what's worth sitting with: 16th century Japan, a society we tend to assume was insular and ethnically uniform, had an African man holding the highest rank a warrior could hold. History is almost never as simple as we assume. Let's talk about something else. The samurai myth tends to dodge guns. The samurai image is almost always tied to the sword, specifically the katana. The sole weapon, the honor weapon, the thing a true samurai never put down. But when Portuguese traders brought matchlock firearms to Japan in 1543, how did Japanese samurai respond? They bought them immediately, not after years of deliberation, not after long debates about tradition and honor. Right away. Oda Nobunaga, again, this man shows up at every major turning point in Japanese history, was the first to fully grasp what firearms meant for warfare. He commissioned the production of thousands of matchlock rifles, trained shooters to fire in rotating volleys to keep up a continuous rate of fire, and deployed this tactic at the Battle of Nagashino in 1575. The result: he nearly annihilated the famous cavalry of the Takeda clan in a single morning. Nagashino changed Japanese warfare permanently, and it reveals something very clear: samurai had no romantic attachment to old weapons. They were pragmatic fighters who used whatever gave them an edge. So why does the myth of sword-only samurai persist so stubbornly? The answer lies in a very specific historical era: the Edo-period, which ran from the early 1600s to 1868. This was a time of enforced isolation, where Japan sealed itself off from the outside world and crucially had no major wars. Samurai, who were trained fighters with nothing to fight, were suddenly repurposed into an administrative class. Bureaucrats, teachers, status symbols. The sword in that context became more of a social marker than a combat tool. And it was in this peaceful era that people started writing down philosophical reflections on what it meant to carry a sword, the kind of writing that would later be packaged as Bushido. But there's another truth about the Edo period that nobody likes to bring up. A lot of samurai were flat broke. Think about that for a second. The most honorable class in Japanese society, the people legally protected in the right to carry weapons. The men that even farmers had to bow to when passing on the road, many of them couldn't afford rice. The Japanese feudal system paid samurai in rice, a unit called koku. But as the Edo period economy grew more sophisticated and cash became king, the fixed rice salary became increasingly worthless. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining appearances, armor, swords, the right clothes never went down. Many samurai families slid into serious debt, quietly pawning or selling the very things that honor said they couldn't sell. And then there were the samurai who lost their lords altogether, known as Ronin. The myth romanticizes them as lone, wandering warriors, brooding and dangerous. The reality was usually far less poetic. Ronin had no income, no patron, no social safety net. Many turned to crime, some joined gangs, others scraped together enough to open sword-fighting schools. The Ronin problem was one of the most persistent social crises of the Edo period, and it was the backdrop for one of the most celebrated stories in all of Japanese history. The 47 Ronin, you've probably heard of it. Hollywood made a movie about it. It's been told and retold as the ultimate symbol of samurai loyalty. But the actual story behind it is far more complicated than the legend suggests. In 1701, a young lord named Asano Naganori was publicly humiliated by a court official named Kira Yoshinaka. Pushed past his breaking point, Asano drew his sword and attacked Kira right there inside the shogun's palace, a serious violation of protocol. The punishment was swift and severe. Asano was ordered to commit seppuku ritual self-disembowelment that very day. His entire domain was confiscated, and 47 of his loyal samurai suddenly found themselves masterless Ronin. The samurai code said they should have died with their lord. Instead, they waited. Nearly 2 years, planning in secret. And then on a winter night in 1703, they stormed Kira's compound, killed him, and carried his head to lay before Asano's grave. All of Japan was stunned. Not by the act itself, but by the impossible question it raised. What was the government supposed to do with these men? Legally, they were murderers. Morally, by the samurai code, they had done exactly what they were supposed to do. The government deliberated for nearly 2 months. Finally, rather than execute them as common criminals, 46 of the men were permitted to die by seppuku, the honorable death. But here's the part that rarely gets told. The 47th man, Terasaka Kichimon, was allowed to leave before the attack went forward. Whether it was because of his low rank or because someone wanted to make sure there would be a survivor to tell the story, no one knows for certain. He lived another 50 years and died at age 87. Even in the story that's held up as the purest expression of samurai spirit, there were calculated choices and dark corners that the legend quietly leaves out. And then in 1868, everything collapsed. The Meiji Restoration, one of the fastest social revolutions in human history, dismantled the samurai class in less than a decade. Instead of a feudal military built on bloodlines, Japan constructed a Western-style national army where any citizen could serve. In 1876, a law banned samurai from carrying swords in public. Their final privilege, the right to be visibly armed, was stripped away with a cold stroke of a pen. Some samurai adapted. They became military officers, civil servants, politicians. They channeled the discipline they'd been raised with into the machinery of a modernizing state. Others resisted. Most famously, Saigo Takamori led the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877, a last-stand uprising of samurai who refused to accept the new order. If the name sounds familiar, it's because Saigo was the historical inspiration for the film The Last Samurai. But government rifles don't distinguish between an honorable sword and an ordinary one. The rebellion was crushed. Saigo died by suicide, and the samurai class, as a living institution, was gone. But here is the twist that most people never see coming. The Meiji government, while abolishing samurai as a social class, simultaneously began mythologizing samurai spirit as a tool of national identity. Japan was modernizing at breathtaking speed, borrowing technology and institutions wholesale from the West, and it needed something distinctly Japanese to keep the nation from dissolving into imitation. The samurai, the idealized, cleaned-up version of them, became the answer. This is when Bushido was truly systematized. This is when the 47 Ronin story was put into school curricula. This is when die for your lord was quietly reinterpreted as die for the nation and the emperor. The Meiji government, and later the militarist government that led Japan into World War II, carefully constructed the samurai image as the ideal template, one that every Japanese person, farmer or merchant or factory worker, was expected to aspire to. That's why the kamikaze pilots of World War II were called samurai of the sky. That's why the ethos of sacrificial service spread through wartime factories and military units across the Pacific. Samurai spirit was weaponized not by samurai, but by people who wanted to use their legend for the purposes of a very different age. An age with bombers and battleships where the katana had become purely symbolic. So, what are we left with once we strip away all those layers of myth? We're left with real people. Ambitious, contradictory, sometimes extraordinarily brave, and sometimes bewilderingly ordinary. Women fighting with naginata on battlefields that history chose not to name them in. An African man who became a samurai in a country he'd never heard of before adulthood. Proud warriors teaching sword technique to pay the rent. Ronin sleeping in the rain, wondering what their honor was worth in a world that no longer needed them. And perhaps that version, the complete, complicated, fully human version, is more deserving of genuine respect than the one Hollywood polished up and put in a blockbuster. History is always messier than mythology. And in that mess, people finally appear as what they really are not, symbols, not archetypes, but individuals trying to survive, trying to make meaning, and occasionally in specific moments, reaching towards something larger than themselves. The real samurai, not the mythological ones, were exactly that. Centuries have passed since the last sword was put away for good, but the questions those warriors left behind are still here. What does honor actually mean when the system you swore loyalty to no longer exists? What does courage look like when nobody's watching and nobody asked you to be brave? And whose story out of all those stories is worth telling? Those aren't questions with easy answers. But maybe that's precisely what makes them worth asking. If this story made you think, if you want more of the history that textbooks only skim the surface of, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Every week we go back to the moments that changed the world and look at what was really happening underneath. Script, History of That Day channel. The Samurai Myth, What History Was Afraid to Tell You.